Welcome to the Dialectic. With me is Glen, Carle, and today the Rajput and the Wasp. The Rajput, that is me, Atul Singh, and the Wasp, that is Glen, Carle. Today we will be recording a wonderful podcast. I believe it is going to be wonderful. It makes me sound a bit like Donald Trump, I'm sure, but hey-ho, there we go, that's the zeitgeist. Today we'll be covering the period from the Mayflower to 1776. And who better than Glen, who is a wasp, who had 5 male ancestors, or has 5 male ancestors from the Mayflower, probably 3 or 4 female ancestors. So you are as American.
I think
4. So you are as American as apple pie.
that's right. It's all my doing.
Welcome, Glen.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Atul. Wasps have so faded from their predominance in American culture that even my son, who is as waspy as I am by his heritage, who is highly educated, very bright, culturally aware, interested in history, quite seriously, did not appreciate, and most of his peers don't really understand what wasp even means. It's sort of a vague term meaning elite kind of person, but it's very specific. And it means the Europeans, and the French in particular, still understand it because it's a thumbnail for them of the traditional ruling class, we could say, of America, in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And as we talked about before, and as I think everyone listening knows, those were the founding group of American history and what became the United States, also what became Canada. But we have so fallen from cultural dominance, and this all happened in my lifetime. It really is commensurate with, in many ways, the triumphs of the American ideals during my lifetime, from, say, the end of World War II until today, that people don't know what it means. And I talked about how profoundly the culture of what became America was created and defined by literally just 102 people who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620. And today, we'll talk about how what was then English colonial America came to be the United States, recognizable as today. Okay, let's launch into this. What would you like to know?
People who arrived in 1620 on the Mayflower, handful of people, are clearly English. They have left the Netherlands because they didn't want to be assimilated into Dutch culture. They have come to a strange and unknown land, and yet they are English colonists. Of course, they may not belong to the Church of England. They may share the, shall we say, right of the Church of England in terms of not the modern right, but let's say to the more individualistic side of Protestantism. But nevertheless, they are English. And they go...
Oh, that would be to the left.
Yeah,
but okay.
To the left, as you may say. But the important thing is they go from English colonists in 1620 to a Declaration of Independence in 1776. They go from 1 ship to 13 colonies. And the natural question that pops into my head is why? You could, of course, take the Marxist interpretation of American history or any history and say it was all deterministic. Now, of course, having lived in an India dominated by Marxism and socialism, I do not adhere to that point of view or that school of thought. It is too simplistic. Nothing is really deterministic. There is always some agency. There is always chance. And so what I want to know as someone who has moved to the US, someone who is fascinated by the US, and someone who has some American traits such as anti-authoritarianism and the inability to accept any hierarchy, as to how did we get, in the memorable words of a certain character in Blackadder, Baldric, Private Baldric, how did we get from one state of affairs to the other state of affairs?
Well, it's the most, for me, being, as most of us are, interested in my own country's and society's heritage, which is really an instance of self-absorption to a certain extent, but understandable and I think universal. It's one of the abiding interests of my life. And I'll just really quickly, I hope really quickly, sort of tick off the conventional views of how the American Revolution came to be or what it represents. In most instances, to say that I think that they are too simplistic and therefore misleading. So all of us alive today have been shaped to some extent. This is not meant as a polemical statement by a Marxist interpretation of history, particularly if one is European. That is certainly the case, and it's a way to actually be dismissive of the unique, literally unique in history, attributes of the American Revolution, and to view it as part of this process, which is much larger than itself, and therefore means less. The American Revolution means less than Americans like to believe. I think that is profoundly wrong. The Marxist interpretation says, okay, the American Revolution was fundamentally a controversy among social groups who were struggling to control the means of production of wealth and to force a change in the economy and thus in society. The society and the government in particular being the superstructure over these deeper economic forces. And there's certainly truth to, it is accurate to devote tremendous attention on the influence of economic conditions on the organization and trends in societies. That is certainly true. The American Revolution was not a proto-Marxist revolution, as otherwise in the Marxist view all are. It really is the classical view of what the revolution was, which is the accurate one. Generally speaking, a traditional interpretation of historical events, unless it's solely written by the victim, will tend to be more accurate than revisionists, by definition, are seeking fault in the dominant view. It's critical to have revisionist views to point out assumptions and prejudices in the prevailing frames of reference, but they also tend to err, rather, by being too critical, sort of by definition. So the American Revolution was ideological, political, and constitutional, which sounds very dry. It is a struggle to change the nature of individuals and society with respect to the state in all three of those domains. Another traditional view, I'll explain what these terms mean, I hope in a more vivid way in a moment. It's also traditionally viewed, and I think it's I profoundly agree, that the American Revolution is an expression of the philosophy of natural rights, which emerged and was heatedly debated by leading thinkers of the day in the late 17th century, or late 1600s, and the 1800s. It's the rationalism and the age of enlightenment, the siècle de lumière, that are coming to define the relation of the individual to God, the individual to the state, and the obligations of the state. And it is not, as some semi-religionists have argued, concerning the American Revolution, because of the unique, as Atul touched upon, Pilgrim, Puritan, religious, dissident origin of the American population. But it wasn't really a religious-driven search to impose or redefine social relations with respect to the concepts of original sin and the need for grace. The Puritans were less dominated by religion than I argue, than even we'll say today. And two, the American Revolution, by that point, American society had long since moved past the most intransigent Puritans of the early 1600s. And the American Revolution was not defined by that. It was, as Atul touched upon, profoundly anti-authoritarian. And that may well be, if one had to choose one concept or one driving force in what led to the American Revolution, it would be the anti-authoritarianism, which I touched upon in my last talk. I think it's really, it's stunning that it is coincidentally one of however many hundreds of thousands, I guess, people directly descended from Stephen Hopkins, who was a tavern owner who had been condemned to hang for mutiny in 1609, and whom the Mayflower's leaders feared would become obstreperous again as soon as they landed on America in Plymouth Rock, that compelled them to write up the Mayflower Compact, defining from the get-go American society as a compact among its citizens, each of whom had clearly recognized rights, not granted to them as subjects, but as members of the society. Profoundly revolutionary. It didn't manifest itself explosively, literally, until the American Revolution, but more than the seeds were set from 1620. So anti-authoritarianism or social egalitarianism or at root is critical to the understanding of the American Revolution. There are two other little things quickly, something that will seem sort of strange, something I've only learned relatively recently. When one reads the writings, the concerns and the sayings of the men who drove the revolution in the 1760s and 70s, there is frequently fear of conspiracy. Thomas Hutchinson was the last colonial governor of Massachusetts. He was from Massachusetts. He was profoundly pro-American. He tried to represent the rights of Massachusetts citizens, colonial subjects, to the crown, but within the framework of imperial rule. And he was sincere, but whatever he did or said, he was invariably condemned by the revolutionaries, who became the revolutionaries, as engaged in a vast conspiracy to seize power, disenfranchise the American subject, and take away not only their rights, but their livelihoods and even their lives. And there was no conspiracy.
Sounds a bit like today, Glenn. Sounds a bit like today, where conspiracy theories hold wide sway, and people are convinced about certain truths, even though they may be abject falsehoods.
Absolutely, which is a frightening thought, because sincerity and conviction is sort of what counts. The facts are secondary, and that is alarming, because there are 35 or 40% of the population today that thinks alarming things about what's happening. So that's longer than I intended to go, sort of the classic points. But I want to get to 1783, when the Revolutionary War ended in victory for the Americans and for the independence and creation of the United States. I'd like to look at that from the perspective of, I guess, 5 large rubrics or drivers, to use an intelligence term.
Drivers, as you used in the CIA, and rubrics if you were a professor. I mean, one of the two things you could have done, you could have become a professor and you could have become an intelligence analyst, and you chose the latter.
Well, perhaps happily, since my professor of economics in graduate school is a charming fellow, another WASP like mine, we became good friends. He's now serving a life sentence in a federal prison for spying for Cuba. So,
oh wow! I mean, you certainly had a distinguished professor.
Yeah, he was charming, and he was successful in his chosen treason for 20 years, I think.
Yeah, let's stick to the 5 rubrics. So, begin with the first.
Okay, let's go back 275 years or 250 years. So the conventional story, someone in my generation grew up watching cowboy and Indian movies, and the Indians are often, they might be portrayed as noble, but they're always portrayed as the enemy. And it's never explained why they might be angry at the innocent settlers who are simply trying to grow corn someplace. But that the view is sort of morally and factually neutral, so that John Wayne could be the square-jawed, laconic, classless hero representing American ideals of truth, justice, and the American way. But obviously the reality is profoundly different. And the Indians played a far greater role in what came to be American civilization, and thus the American Revolution, than I think is almost recognized anywhere.
So let me stop you here, Glenn. So the first rubric, to signpost this for our audience, for our listeners, as our chair Claire Price always tells us to do, The first rubric is Indians, or rather Native Americans, as some would call them, and their effect on English colonists and their sense of the self, and how that sense of the self, their sense of the self, eventually became distinct from their English roots and by extension their European heritage. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And how did this happen? And what the hell am I talking about? So in 1620, the Pilgrims landed Plymouth Rock, just a short distance from where I'm speaking now. And culturally, the critical dynamics for the evolution of American history, I would argue, but I'm parochial perhaps, happened here in Massachusetts and New England, as opposed to further south in Virginia, which preceded by a decade, but was a backwater and culturally far more conservative. Put that aside. So what happened?
Even today you have Harvard and MIT, and what does Virginia have?
That's right. But that's another subject. From 1620 until 1675, you had dramatic, dynamic growth of the English colonies of Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay. So that from the 102 people who landed in November 1620, by 1675, you had about 80 to 100,000 English colonists in what's now eastern Massachusetts. For all of this period, and I'll call them the Indians, it's a generational term, it is not meant pejoratively. I understand that for many it's considered, or now one should say Native American, although I'll point out that the American Conference of Indian Tribes, or whatever the term is, had a vote and they chose that Indian was the proper term. But this is a polemic that I hope I will be spared if I continue to use the Indians, and which is meant not in any way derogatory. So
no, you're doing it with an Indian, the one with the dot, not the feather.
The real one. You're the only real one. That's right. We got totally screwed up and didn't know what the hell we were doing, and we missed by an entire continent, half the earth, and entire races. But that's okay.
Right, it's okay. You conquered both. You conquered both at the end. You took over Americas and you took over India, so it's all good in the end.
We all make little errors. So why are the Indians significant? From 1620 to 1675, specifically 1675, the Indians, one, accepted the settling, the arrival of the Plymouth and Massachusetts colonies. And why did they do that? It was a tactical and strategic decision on specific Indian tribes' parts, because they needed the manpower and alliance of these Europeans in their own inter-tribal conflicts for power and defense and so on. Otherwise, when the Mayflower landed, they would have wiped them out, as the same tribe did to a French whaling ship 5 years before the arrival of the Mayflower in 1615. A French whaling ship ran aground. There were 20 survivors. They instantaneously got into a fight with the Wampanoag Indians here in Massachusetts. The Indians killed 15 of them, enslaved the remaining 5, and unfortunately for the Indians, one of those 5 Frenchmen had smallpox, or carried it. And that caused an epidemic, the likes of which we cannot imagine. 90% of all Indians from what is now Canada to what is now New York City, a coastline of 1,500 kilometers, 90% of all the Indians died from the disease. I think it was smallpox. So when the Pilgrims showed up, there was hardly anyone left. All of their political dynamics and the status of the tribes had been disrupted, and the local tribe on whose land the Pilgrims landed needed an ally. That was the case, simply put, from 1620 to 1675. By 1675, and so though culturally, the approach of the English to the Indians was twofold. One, there was this messianic millennial view that they were the lost tribes of Israel. The Indians were. They were benighted, uncivilized for a number of reasons, and we had to
civilize them.
Yes, we had to civilize them by Christianizing them and making them wear wool instead of loincloth and so on, live in a house instead of a longhouse and so on. But there was an assimilation. an amalgamation, rather, of the cultures. The English were not numerous enough to define the cultural dynamic, and they embraced many Indian cultural practices to survive with regard to farming, but also that it was a permeable society to a certain extent by obligation because of numbers and power balances and so on. From 1620 to 1675. By 1675, you now had 100,000 Englishmen. You had about 80,000 Indians in Massachusetts, apparently. The dynamic had changed. No longer were the English, did their survival depend upon the good grace of the Indians. Rather, the Indians saw, as we all know, and this is all true, the Indians saw all of their land being taken. The English prided themselves, we only did this contractually. A lot of the contracts were fraudulent. But their hunting grounds, it was a hunting-gathering society, which also was shifting to agriculture rather than pastoral society, farming society like the English. And so their way of life was threatened with extinction, they being the Indians. They were losing their land. The power dynamics, because of the shifting population ratios, was profoundly upset. And an Indian chief named Metacomet, that was his Indian name at birth. He was also named King Philip. That is not pejorative. It is from an English perspective, but he himself used the term King Philip, feared what would happen. And he was under pressure from other tribes and from his own younger braves to somehow respond and protect the Indian way of life before it was completely destroyed. The governor of Massachusetts Bay was a man named Winslow. Unfortunately for history, King Philip and Winslow were average men. They were not great men who could see a subtle step to take that might advance their respective causes while avoiding a cataclysm. Instead, they reacted viscerally, defensively, and projected onto the other their own views, as all of us do. So in 1675, a number of events happened, but the Plymouth colony hanged 3 Indians for murder. They probably were guilty, but it was a vengeance murder, which under Indian law was probably justified. King Philip felt he had to respond, and 3 days after the hanging, which occurred just 5 kilometers from here, 8 kilometers at most, King Philip's War began. It was, in terms of proportion of those killed, both in combat, the combatants and citizens of the respective societies, the worst war by far in American history. Over the course of about 18 months, 15 months, 1675 to 1676, 20%, I believe, of Massachusetts citizens, the Englishmen, were killed. At that time, Massachusetts extended from the ocean, perhaps 200 kilometers west, with a series of scattered settlements. And the attacks by the Indians were so devastating and so successful that virtually all settlements, more than 50 kilometers west of the coast, were destroyed or forced to be, or had to be abandoned. And the Massachusetts government came close to deciding to build a palisade, build a wall from what is today New Hampshire south to the Long Island Sound or Rhode Island, which would have been a distance of anything from 200 to 300 kilometers, which would have been completely impotent to stop Indian attacks. But they were so afraid that they had to retreat really within the walls of Boston almost, that it was that devastating. Devastating as that was for the whites, for the English, it was virtually a genocide for the Indians, and about 80% of all the Indians were killed or captured, then enslaved, and then sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Most of those ships never arrived at their destinations. They sank on the way. And so robust tribes of anything from several thousand to several dozens of thousands of Indians were reduced really to nothing. And the Indians ceased to be a living presence in the history of New England after that. So that was terrible. But why is it significant for what we're talking about? Because from that point on, the war had been so horrific. The threat to the Englishmen was viewed as so critical, such an existential threat, that never again did Indian and white society have a real chance of weaving together in any sort of a way. The power dynamic had changed. They became the other, the savage, evil. And there were religious frameworks placed upon this, because some of the leaders of Massachusetts Bay were, profound Puritan bigots. And American history then became a series, frankly, of progressive exterminations. And that was made certain. Perhaps it would have happened even without this terrible war, but it certainly happened in part because of it, because it did happen. So prior to 1675, American civilization, as it was evolving and developing, was less Manichaean with respect to the Indians by obligation, I would say, because white people were relatively weak. But afterwards, they were so afraid, so angry, that it became a purely Anglo-Saxon, a purely English culture. And in that way, it hewed closer to England culturally than might have been the case. Definitive war and period in shaping what became American society. Totally forgotten today. No one knows what King Philip's War was. No one studies anything prior to the American Revolution, generally. So I would argue that is one of the 5 or so critical points in shaping American society that then led to revolution in 1776.
Now let me interject here. So you've just said they became more English, but that was more English in heritage. That was more English perhaps in the language they spoke, and perhaps English in culture. But at the same time, politically, because they had fought off individually and collectively the Indians or the Native Americans, and because they had organized themselves into militias, perhaps, they had a greater sense of self. They were not like English yeoman farmers in Yorkshire or yeoman farmers elsewhere, Devonshire. They were different. They had become different. War had forced them into a different entity.
Well, I think war contributed to that, yes. Certainly the Pilgrims and all Americans, but especially the Pilgrims in New England, as dissidents, as people who were nonconformists, who did not accept the rule of the Church of England, of the Anglican Church, who were months away from the ruling authority, had a degree of self-rule which was almost total from literally the first day, from before they landed, from the Mayflower Compact, written on the Mayflower off the shore of Provincetown, Massachusetts. That's absolutely true and absolutely critical, which I'll get to in a little bit. What was the second driving force or rubric from the period of 1620 to the Revolution? And this is a more conventionally known one, and it was the French. It was the historic, titanic, world-shaping clash between the two great powers in Europe, between France and England, from the American perspective, from 1607, from the first English arrival, from 1620 here, until 1763. Again, completely.
And it sharpens. So what you're saying, the second driver was the Anglo-French struggle for supremacy, which was global and certainly most acute in North America.
Oh, well, the state were control of a continent and domination of the world. So there's pretty high stakes. And from the American perspective, for 140 years, the clash defined everything. The English colonies depended completely for their survival and protection on England. Forgotten today were all the wars. My ancestors fought in them all. There was And this is not even all of them. King William's War in 1694, Queen Anne's War in 1701, King George's War in 1748, and then the French and Indian War, which is known as which is 7 Years' War globally from 1754 to 1763. In each of those wars, which the Americans named after the ruling sovereign of the moment, the American colonies were involved and engaged in all wars of hideous, I suppose, in hideous fighting all along the frontier between French Canada, which is now Quebec, and the United States, which at the time was the New England colonies, New York, and Maryland, Pennsylvania, largely, and even down to Virginia. And both sides used the Indians as allies, had the Indians as allies, although predominantly the French had better relations always with Indian tribes than the English. And that was because of relative French weakness. The French didn't seek to, but they couldn't have, even if they wanted to, impose an English way of life on the land and on the Indians. They simply traded with them because there were only 80,000 Frenchmen. And by 1760, there were over 2 million English in North America. But those wars all occurred, each of them lasting 4 years or so, or a decade, in North America, and were the clash between France and England. So the colonies had to look to England for their survival. Otherwise, they would have been quite possibly overrun by the French and their Indian allies, and the nature of North America could have changed. And it came close to doing so a number of times. But that ended when the English triumphed on the Plains of Abraham, just outside the gates and walls of Quebec City in 1759. It's a famous dramatic moment when the French commanding general Montcalm and the English commanding general Wolfe met on the Plains of Abraham. Both of them were killed in the battle at the moment. The English won, occupied Quebec, and defeated the French in North America. And the peace agreement ceded North American French possessions to England. And that ended any threat to the colonies from France, which sounds good and is what the colonists had sought for 140 years. But what that meant was that since there was no threat anymore, why does the colony need England anymore? And all of a sudden, and that was predicted by various English leaders at the time. They said, this is not a good thing here. They will no longer look to us. And that's very quickly what happened. And this was exacerbated. As most of us know, the conventional point of the origin of the revolution that we all hear about is no taxation without representation. So the English had, of course, as wars tend to do, terribly indebted themselves to wage the 7 Years' War. And for two reasons, sought to impose certain taxes on the colonists. One, so to recoup some of the expense of the war and to pay their debt, the British-English debt, and to have the colonists pay in part for their own protection. With that, we do know. So that's the second thing, the influence of the Indians then becoming a Manichaean polarization, helping to define what American character was, and the elimination of France as a threat, and ironically, as a unifying force between the colonies and the Crown in London.
So we've done two rubrics. Now, the third rubric, of course, is England itself, as we were discussing in our chat before this podcast. And we must examine, of course, the nature of England and the struggle within England, the English Civil War, which was between the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. The Roundheads triumphed under Oliver Cromwell. They even invaded Ireland, committed a lot of atrocities. In fact, you could argue they treated the Irish a bit like the Indians. And
I think only the Irish appreciate how poorly, or maybe the Indians appreciate how poorly the English treated them.
Indeed. And then, of course, you have the Glorious Revolution, 1688. I mean, before that, of course, the king comes back because Oliver Cromwell dies, and the Roundheads impose a puritanical regime, no theatre, no colour, and the Cavaliers mount a comeback, and English Cavaliers have always managed to adapt, unlike the French aristocrats, who, as we know, were put to the sword, or rather the guillotine, in 1789 or later. 1789 is the revolution, the guillotine follows. But the important thing is that the Cavaliers come back to power, and in 1688, Charles II flees, you have a glorious revolution, you have William of Orange, and now you have a pretty stable English monarchy, which has persisted to this day. But suddenly now the Puritans, guilty of regicide, those who had killed Charles I, are in hot water, and so are a lot of extreme Protestants. And now they start coming to the US. In fact, a lot of the Roundheads end up in the US, fleeing England. And England itself is now a very steady ship. They have a stable, democratic form of government, although they do not have anything like universal suffrage. But it's more democratic than any other society. But it's also a hierarchical society. It is a paternalistic society. It is an earlier form of, yes, minister and yes, prime minister sort of society. with a democratic elite ruling both the home counties or the home countries and the colonies. And so let's talk about England.
Right. Well, critical. I mean, it almost is so central to the evolution of what came to be the American Revolution and American society that we might overlook it because it seems so obvious, but true. Everything you say, I completely agree with. There are sort of ironic and seemingly contradictory points that emerged from the struggles and changes in England that shaped America. Yet, absolutely central to what became American society and then the Revolution is the anti-authoritarianism that we touched upon before, enhanced, I guess you could say, by the Revolution and the sympathy for the anti-hierarchical ideology or impulses of the Revolution and the reaction against the hierarchical class top-down society. Ironically, however, after the Revolution, the English governments, the Crown, sought to suppress, well, actually they did suppress, the Massachusetts Constitution as being insufficiently subordinate to the Crown. And that created a near revolution in the late 1680s and early 1690s in Massachusetts, because what the Massachusetts colonists, citizens, believed were their natural-born rights had been taken away for a few years. And the governor was forced to leave. The governor was ignored if he didn't leave. And resistance to the Crown became a defining aspect of how a Massachusetts citizen could affirm his rights and his proper place in society. In an example, I would argue, and maybe this is easy to say in hindsight, of the Crown's overreach by trying to reestablish its authority after the Glorious Revolution. But so you have the Revolution, sympathy for the Roundhead, commoner philosophy, anti-authoritarianism, which was native to, frankly, the evolution of what was becoming American society. And then you had, strangely, no, before I get to that, critical things which most people will talk about is the driving forces, because this is what American leaders and intellectuals talked about, and it is very important. It's what is the spirit of the age? It's the age of from, say, second half of the 1600s and the first half of the 1700s. It is the age of enlightenment. It is the age of reason. It's the age of Voltaire and Locke, and Rousseau is slightly later, but rational man and natural rights. But all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. This was not out of whole cloth did it come in the American Declaration of Independence, but were the driving struggles ideologically of the English Revolution. How do you respond to the chaos of the Revolution? Hobbes thought that only by a strong central government can you avoid the state of nature and complete chaos. Locke thought, as did Montesquieu or a generation later, that only by really diffusing power and recognizing natural rights intrinsic to each human could you protect the individual from oppression. And those were the leading arguments of the day. America didn't have an indigenous intellectual tradition, really. You could argue how, but not until the 19th century. They had brilliant people, but the leading thinkers were certainly the philosophical sons of the leading arguments and trends in Europe. And in this case, in England, as a result of the English Revolution, the Enlightenment thinkers of Locke and those seeking to moderate the power of the state and to recognize the rights of the individual became the dominant views of the Massachusetts, the New England citizens, for whom all of these thoughts were congenial anyway, given the anti-authoritarian heritage, the dissident heritage that were so defining to American culture. And so England, that, and to serve an obvious point, was central to what became America between 1675, 76, the end of King Philip's War, and 1663, when American Revolution started to foment.
So the English intellectual revolution, or the English aspect or element of the Enlightenment with its thinkers like John Locke, profoundly influential, in fact, the third driver of the American Revolution. And dare I say, one could argue that Thomas Paine's common sense is a direct product of that intellectual tradition.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. That he's viewed a bit as a brilliant polemicist, and he wasn't an original thinker, but as someone who could distill and express the driving thoughts, unsurpassed. So that you have these intellectual traditions evolving out of sort of obviously the political struggles which led to cultural pressures and changes. And then the freeing of the Americas from the need to defer to and look to England at all times, which fit with their inclinations anyway, because they had largely been a several-month journey away and ruling themselves, but not allowed to do things. There was no manufacturing allowed. Glass, one could not manufacture glass. There was no industry permitted by the crown in the Americas. All of these things would probably profoundly irritate anybody who had to live under that. And they did, as I think, Atul, you may literally have firsthand experience in. Well, not quite, because you were born after the Indian independence, but England didn't change, the imperialist powers didn't change their practices from 1750 to the 1940s. I think England did the same thing to India.
No, my father was born before independence, and for him, and he wasn't exactly very old, he was just 4 years old on the day of independence, or 4 or 5. But the important thing is his elder brothers always talked about living under a draconian English rule, which was certainly one of rule of law, but the law was skewed against you. And most importantly, economically, the situation was dire and exploitative as well as expropriative. So England was literally squeezing every single paisa, every single cent, every single penny from India that it could. India was a producer of raw materials, and England was an exporter of finished goods. This was not how things began in 1757 with the East India Company when they were trading Indian goods, but that is what things had transpired to by the late 19th century or the mid-19th century, certainly the late, and the rest of the 20th century. Also, British investment in India was guaranteed high returns backed by the taxpayer. So India was literally the golden goose. Yeah, and the British did profit from it. So, I mean, the fourth driver you're talking about is the evolution of a uniquely American culture in the 13 colonies and how they came to resent this form of exploitation of the colonies, which, mind you, the Spanish did too. Spanish simply took a lot of silver from the New World. And a lot of that silver, in fact, a third of that silver ended up in Ming China. and actually caused the hyperinflation thanks to the single whip law in 1580 that led to the collapse of the Ming dynasty. But we'll cover that in another podcast and compare and contrast through the ages. Right now, let's go back to the fourth driver, the evolution of a uniquely American culture in the 13 colonies.
Well, how are Americans different from the English? Actually, the American accent, as some of you may know, is how English was spoken, more or less how English was spoken in the early 1700s. English has evolved, and the way languages evolve is the cultural center of the language of English certainly always was London. And the American colonies were very much a backwater. So the backwater will always follow the trends of the cultural center. What happened was that the Americans left England. Well, the English settled, their colonists went to America and continued to speak as they had spoken at the time of their departure. But English as a language evolved in London, which shaped the changes or dominated the changes. So, for example, the English do not pronounce their R's. They'll say, I drive a car. I can't do a good English accent. But Americans say, I drive a car, and continue to pronounce the R. Now, if you're from Boston or New York, you will also, if you speak the local accent, you will drop the R. Why? Because trade with and connections to the mother country were much closer and more frequent in Boston and in New York, which is where the ships landed and the influence extended. But in the hinterland of the backwoods of New Hampshire or New York, the changes didn't reach as frequently or as powerfully. So, sort of ironically, America speaks an older English than the English do. Similar, it's the same thing with the French Canadians. They speak a French from the 17th century to a large extent, whereas French has evolved because Paris dominated the language. In any event, what became central to American culture that distinguished it from England? And we've talked about many of the driving forces and cultural, political pressures. And I would argue that the single statement that distinguishes the two societies is that there had never been a society, an American society evolved to be a society in which the society was based on the commonplace behavior of ordinary people, as opposed to the individuals being subject to, dependent upon, and serving a hierarchical social structure and looking up to their betters. In the wonderful film, The Last of the Mohicans, based on James Fenimore Cooper's book.
I know someone who's a descendant of that gentleman, the iconic
Fenimore Cooper.
Yeah. Someone who's
America's first great writer.
Yeah, someone who's appeared on our YouTube channel.
Well, that's an illustrious.
Yeah, Professor Ann Hoffman.
That is an illustrious ancestor to claim. He's America's first, really significant novelist. Also from a loyalist family, which I'll get to in a moment. So in the film, however, it's during what the Americans call the French and Indian War, what everyone else knows as the 7 Years' War, the decisive clash between France and England that England won. And it's a moment of crisis in the war, and there's an English officer astride his horse, of course, in uniform, trying to organize and rally the soldiers, the American militia who are fighting the French. And they're disorganized, and they're standing around, they're all angry, and things are going all completely wrong. And the Englishman is indignant and trying to bring order out of chaos. And he says, he's trying to exhort his men. He says, don't you realize that you are British subjects? And standing on the ground beside him, laconically, sort of leaning on his musket, is an American militiaman who looks up at him and rather insolently says, I don't reckon I am subject to anybody. But that really defines the evolution of the culture, whereas Americans went from considering themselves by the nature of the universe as subjects in a hierarchy to being individuals of equal worth and with equal say to anyone. Now, the reality always falls short of the ideal, but that is the defining ideal and with much substance of what came to be American society and why the American Revolution occurred. And that happened for the reasons we've touched upon: the anti-authoritarianism, the separation from the crown by distance, the dissident nature of the religious grounding of the culture, the effect of Indians separating the English colonists from the English, and yet then defining them more purely because of the existential threat. But that is this indigenous American culture, which has actually, I would argue, distilled the trend of Western history and defined it ever since.
And indigenous not in as the indigenous Indians or Native Americans, indigenous as in something that developed thanks to English and later European colonists setting root in the American continent.
Distinctive to Europeans who became Americans. Yes, it is poor choice of term or confusing choice of term by me. So that then brings us to the last point.
So the fifth point. And the fifth point, I find it fascinating because that is the happenstance of history. That is the power of individuals. That is the power of rabble rousers. That is the power of the likes of Lenin, who can lead a vanguard to revolution. And so over to you, Glen, because you are sitting near Boston where it all began.
Where it all began. And I came to this perception or conviction or assessment, all of the above, through my career as an intelligence officer. Growing up in America, certainly in Boston, someone of my generation, when one studies the origins of America and the American Revolution, one learns about the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were a group of men, first in Boston, but then they had brother branch organizations throughout the colonies, who are portrayed in the traditional American narrative as people trying to defend the rights of the colonists, individual rights, and are therefore heroes for freedom. Well, yes, but also pretty strong no. They were a consciously run covert action organization at a time when that term didn't exist, who set out, they were in favor of independence at a time when almost no one in America was. They were willing to use force to achieve their ends. They were more than, they aggressively used disinformation and propaganda to achieve their ends. And they set out to manipulate society and to discredit all authority figures of the crown. The most famous example, they ran a whole series of covert operations that shaped history. And the most famous of them was what everyone knows, if anyone has ever heard of it, as the Boston Massacre, which is a term invented by the Sons of Liberty. So in March 1770, there were tensions over a host of causes that conventionally are typically discussed as the causes of the revolution: no taxation without representation, closing of the port, barracking of troops in citizens' homes, and so on. And the Sons of Liberty fomented a series of mobs to harass British soldiers who were guarding the colonial governor's house and the state. And they started to taunt these soldiers who were under strict orders to not to do anything provocative or aggressive. They started to throw snowballs at them. They started to threaten them with their lives, to hundreds of people crowd around a half dozen soldiers. Then they started to throw snowballs filled with rocks, which I can tell you is from a boy's experience. My childhood, can draw blood. And the 5 soldiers outside the State House tried to march away, and they felt threatened for their lives. They were then ordered, I think repeatedly by their commanding officer, "You will not fire." But it became so dangerous that they presented their weapons with bayonets, I think drawn, just to keep themselves from being overwhelmed. It's unclear, as always in this kind of event, exactly what happened, but a shot or shots were fired and 5 people were killed. The first one killed was a man named Crispus Attucks, who was a free black resident of Boston. And then there was chaos. The soldiers fled to the barracks, and the city was in an uproar. For the funeral, several days later, there were 12,000 people in a town of a population of 16,000 who marched to what was called the Liberty Pole. And this was a pole, literally a pole around which people would march to demonstrate in favor of their rights, which had been denied them by the crown. And then someone we all know, Paul Revere, who was a coppersmith, made an engraving of the event in which he shows the innocent citizens being massacred by the massed, organized army firing into the crowd. But that's not what happens at all. The crowd provoked them intentionally so as to create an incident. And the crowd didn't even do this. It was the Sons of Liberty who was manipulating the crowd, much like, frankly, in 1953, the CIA did in Tehran, Iran, finding certain instigators to foment a riot and industrial revolution. And that engraving was sent around the colonies and inflamed, almost literally, the population. That was the single most notable instance. But there were many such actions by the Sons of Liberty. And the revolution came.
I mean, there's a claim that a lot of them were smugglers and they simply didn't want to pay taxes to the British crown for smuggling in tea. And that tea was coming from the East.
Absolutely. Yeah, it wasn't just the sort of the uncouth, thuggish side, but the leading citizens, the richest ones in Massachusetts, were seeing their livelihoods destroyed by the imposition of closing the harbor. The British closed Boston Harbor. The British were more rigorously, for the first time in American history, trying to regulate trade and to stop illicit trade. That might have been unfair and unjust, but it certainly threatened the livelihoods of John Hancock, who was the first president of the American Continental Congress, and other leading citizens. And so there was clear material aspect to the opposition to the Crown's steps at the same time. So what then happened? Well, the revolution came, and that's passively stated, but these series of events were so polarized, the various grievances and tensions, that then violence did become inevitable. But as conventionally portrayed, the revolution was freeing America of the yoke and establishing independence. And that is true. And it truly did create a unique, indigenous, egalitarian, idealistic society for the first time in history. But fundamentally, I argue, the more one learns of the revolution, the more one realizes that, like, I think probably any revolution, any civil war, it was a civil war. My ancestors are representative. Some of them were ardent patriots, that meant in favor of the revolution. An equal number, at least, were loyalists who thought that these were a bunch of rabble-rousers who were destroying the organization of society and taking away the rule of law, so that everyone was a danger of domination from a violent mob and mass, which was also true because you saw it in the Boston Massacre. And then others of them tried to stay out of the way. And my most fascinating, in some ways, ancestor represented the complete confusion that was only resolved by the victory of what we now call the American side. And he was a member of, I won't go at length, but to illustrate the dilemma that all of these events led to, the crisis and confusion. At first, he was a soldier in the American Army and was part of the invasion force by the Americans of British Quebec. They were defeated barely. He fought under Benedict Arnold. Then, when the British invaded New York 2 years later, not long after that, his home was destroyed, first by the Americans marching north to oppose the British, and second by the British marching south to conquer the Americans. And so his home was he never could return. It was utterly destroyed by both sides. Then he decided to switch sides and he became a soldier for the British. Why? Because he saw that the Americans had committed more depredations than the British on his home and denied him everything that he and his family had spent their lives working for, and he had had no say in that whatsoever. and the British promised him rule of law and the restitution of his property and his rights. And so he fought for the British, and then they lost, ultimately. And he could never return home. And he became one of the founding English settlers of what is now Ontario. That's what settled Ontario, were loyalists. He became a loyalist. But he had fought for both sides, and he actually fought for a third side because he was from what were called the New Hampshire Grants. That's now known as Vermont. And this is another reason for his disaffection. He settled the land. He was given a patent for it by Massachusetts, by Connecticut, and by New Hampshire governors. New York didn't recognize this. This was a no man's land, Vermont was. And they sent military forces in and took away his land and the land of other settlers of Vermont, saying that this belonged to New York, and so your grant is invalid. And only the English crown promised to restore the rights of the Vermont citizens, and Vermont almost went over to the British side. He did. Vermont did not as a whole. But there was complete confusion, and only the triumph of the American side led to what seems to be a coherent story when it was a civil war over fundamental right, manipulated all of these forces that we talked about, manipulated ultimately, decisively, I would argue, by the covert actions of the Sons of Liberty that substantially, not only them, but substantially shaped what came to be American opinion and led to American triumph. And that's how we got from 1620 to 1776.
Now, what is fascinating is that George Washington, the first president, started off as an American militia member fighting for the British. He did fight in the Indian Wars of the 7 Years' War. Similarly, Benjamin Franklin was also very English in his cultural outlook, and in fact worried about German immigration changing the culture of the colonies. Thomas Jefferson was also an Englishman in the Enlightenment tradition who looked up to England and France as the mothership of culture and political thought. So all these men somehow ended up fighting for independence. That's a phenomenal turnaround, or a phenomenal shift of opinion and loyalty.
Well, the British did a lot wrong, and I suppose losers, frequently do. Washington was, as you say, a militia captain in the French and Indian War. In fact, it was George Washington, literally George Washington, who fired the first shot in and started the 7 Years' War, which became this World War, in what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 1753. I won't go into all the details, but he was the commander, as a very young, inexperienced man, of the colonial forces under the command of the English general Braddock. Braddock was sent with a massive force for the day from now Alexandria, Virginia, to what is now Pittsburgh to expel the French in 1755. Commanding the American forces under Braddock was George Washington. At the planning sessions in Alexandria early in 1755, Washington said, "Sir, I have been to the area where we are going. Here are the tactics that the French and their Indian allies use. Here is the nature of the terrain, and that should shape the organization of the force that we take in following ways." And Braddock viewed Washington as a subject who had nothing to say to him because he was the English general. And he dismissed him, not from his command, but from any say, and said, "You'll do what I order you to do." And that's it. Braddock marched his army to complete annihilation. He was killed fighting bravely himself on the field of battle. The French completely wiped out his force. As Washington said would happen, Washington survived and took command of the force that then retreated, the surviving men who retreated, and thus the 7 Years' War came. But why was that significant? It was typical. The British were domineering, condescending, dismissive of all things American, and even though an otherwise conventional man aspiring to conventional leadership and success in English society, George Washington, tried to play by the rules as they were set he was not allowed to because he was viewed as something lesser. And when you combine that to the destruction of people's livelihoods and the imposition by force of a distant will, that pushed even someone like Washington to become a revolutionary.
And so it was not all covert action, but covert action certainly played a big role because they were able to get critical mass of charismatic, competent, and organized people together to pull off a successful revolution.
Well, I think more importantly than that, they unified and mobilized and shaped the hostility of the general population sufficiently to oppose English rule. It was no longer elites arguing about rights. It was an angry mob in every city denouncing oppression. And it's something that the authorities, the colonial leaders and the English leaders, whether they were military or civil, could never come to terms with. And I often have thought that there are similarities to the Vietnamese Revolution, actually, as you want to call it, as you should call it, with the American one, where the population came to, a decisive percentage of the population came to hate what was viewed as an oppressor, whereas the British hadn't really been oppressors. They had been clumsy, arrogant, yet distant overlords. So I think that's how we came to have the revolution, and to view it, I suppose one must, to have a coherent history, as this timeline moving clearly towards individual rights and freedom, but which led to a distinct culture, then decisively moved by more extreme elements to independence in what then could only be, I think inevitably be, a civil war. That's a bit revisionist and more sympathetic to the loyalist view than the standard American view, but that's how I see it.
Well, I think there's more than an element of truth as captured by the story of Rip Van Winkle, who goes to sleep as a loyal subject of the king and wakes up to an independent citizen of the United States of America.
It's a wonderful tale. And I've been to his home in the Hudson Valley, one of the most beautiful places I've ever been, the Hudson Valley there. And yes, I think you're right. I think the changes were literally revolutionary and profound in the space of not even a generation, in some ways just 15 years.
On that happy note, we will round it off and we will continue the dialectic between the Rajput and the Wasp on things current as well as times past. If you're listening to us, make sure you like this podcast, you follow us, you leave us a review. Also go to our website, www.fairobserver.com, and sign up for our newsletters. And if you think independent journalism deserves a shot in this world where Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post and Steve Jobs' widow owns the Atlantic, and the Qatari government runs Al Jazeera, and the British government runs the BBC, then maybe sign up for a $10 per year donation on fairobserver.com. We are independent, we are non-profit, we are crowdsourced, crowd-funded, and we provide you fact-based, well-reasoned perspectives from around the world. I know, very unfashionable indeed, but what do you expect from a Rajput and Wasp? All the best.